Okay, so this video is covering learning objective 3, which is to kind of discuss some of the key features of economic growth business cycles in the U.S. economy over the past 100 years or so. So towards that end, a key term when we talk about economic growth and business cycles is what we call the trend. And the trend is really just the general direction right, or average growth or decline in a variable over time. Right, so when we look at the trend, we're looking at a smooth path for the variable that kind of represents its average tendency, right? Does it tend to stay roughly constant on average, or does it tend to go up or go down, right? And so this is the trend, is what economic growth is all about. So the trend is going to be a very smooth feature of the data. So on the next graph here, you can see the blue line there is a very smooth path, and that's our trend in log GDP, right, per capita. So our log income per person, or it could just be income per person, doesn't matter. The blue line is the rough trend, right? So it tells me what's the general path of this variable over time, smoothing out any ups and downs that happen year to year. So the trend is all about economic growth, whether we're going up or down in general over time. Now, of course, the actual line deviates from that trend on a year-to-year basis, quarter to quarter, month to month. There's little movements up and down in the variable that reflect various shocks to the economy. And so it's those deviations from the trend that are what going to measure our business cycle. So if I can draw kind of a line here, right, you've got a deviation from trend. Right, the actual is different than the trend value, and that is precisely what we call the business cycle. So in the next graph, I've actually plotted those deviations from the trend. So how much did log GDP differ from the trend? Remember, since we're taking log differences, these deviations are percentage changes, right? So that's why working with logs is nice. Rather than having to calculate the deviation from trend, then the percent change, I'll just take logs of the variables and then calculate the difference in the log. How does the log of actual differ from the log of the trend? And that's the approximate growth rate, or the percentage change. And here's what we see on the graph, right? So where it's positive, like here, we're above trend. So as we'll see, the economy is doing well. It's growing quickly. Where it's below trend, the economy tends to be doing worse than it normally would be. As we see here in the Great Depression, right? So just kind of briefly, so that's the main idea, right? So in business cycles, we're looking at deviations from trend. How does the log of, let's say, GDP differ from the log of the trend? Is it above or below trend? Now, just a few quick facts. Learning objective is, what are some main features of deviations from trend in the U.S. economy? So one thing that we notice is that there's regular deviations from trend, right? So the economy is fluctuating on a quarter-to-quarter, year-to-year basis all the time. So there's fairly regular business cycles. So as an economist, I get asked this question all the time. Is the economy going to dip into a recession? Now, my sort of trick answer back is yes, right? So why can I be confident saying that is that our history here suggests that the economy is always fluctuating between expansion and recession. We're going above trend. Eventually, we're going to go below trend, which we define as a recession. And so we know that this is at some point going to happen. Now, the reason it's a difficult question is, as we'll see, predicting exactly when the economy goes into recession is much more difficult than just knowing at some point in the future we will have another recession. Okay, so first fact here is that we have regular business cycles. The economy's moving between above trend and below trend with some frequency. Okay, now what's another feature is that really since 1950, the sort of deviations from trend have gotten a little bit smaller. Right, so we're still moving above and below, but they've gotten a bit smaller than what we saw in this period here, which is driven a lot by the Great Recession. And so business cycles have tended to be a bit more mild than they were in the early part of the U.S. economy. Through the 1950s, 1900 to 1950, the fluctuations were a bit larger. So, that's... I guess if I made a third fact is that expansions above trend tend to last longer than recessions, at least in the modern since 1950, right? So we have recessions, but they've at least, at least up until 2010, 2008, have tended to be relatively mild. Okay, so that's just kind of a very brief overview, give you a sense of what we're looking at when we look at business cycles. A few basic facts, we can kind of see it on the graph here, what's going on. Nothing really to worry too much about, but just getting some terminology out of the way.